Hello, a very warm welcome to our CoJiT podcast series. My name is Anthony Richards and I'm the editorial director of CoJiT. The purpose of this podcast series is to discuss particular themes within terrorism and counterterrorism, themes of particular contemporary relevance. And today we've got a special edition which revolves around the theme of terrorist prisoners. And in particular, we're going to focus on the Fishmonger's Hall attack that took place in November 2019, and that tragically led to the deaths of 2 young people. And we're also going to focus on the findings of the inquest into the attack that was completed recently. As I'm sure you'll recall, Usman Khan stabbed a number of people at the Learning Together event, and that was an initiative that brings offenders and those in higher education to study together. The recent inquest into what happened revealed a number of shortcomings, not least the collective failure to appreciate the danger that Khan presented, the apparent and relative inexperience of Khan's probation and police management team, and that there seemed to be no security or bag searches at the event. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Professor Andrew Silke. He's Professor of Risk and Resilience at Cranfield University, and he's a highly respected authority within terrorism studies. He has over 100 publications, and his most recently published work was the Routledge Handbook on Terrorism and Counterterrorism in 2019. And he also edited the volume Prisons, Terrorism and Extremism, which was also published with Routledge in 2014. Andrew, a warm welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to join you, Anthony.
My first question, a very general question, I guess, Andrew, is having absorbed some of the findings of the recent inquest, what do you think went wrong in terms of the management of Usman Khan? And what do you think have been the main lessons to draw from this tragic case?
Yeah, I mean, the inquest, I think, has been incredibly revealing, and I think it's given an unprecedented insight into how terrorist offenders are managed and are risk assessed both in prison and after they're released. And I don't think we've ever before had such a public detailed analysis of how that happens and how it operates. And I think, number one, that's incredibly valuable because it's shed light on both the tools that the professionals are using in these cases, but also in terms of how the whole process operates. And it's probably worth saying as well at the start that reoffending by released terrorist prisoners in the UK is very low. So individuals like Usman Khan are the exception. They're not the rule, and by and large, there are much more positive outcomes when people are released compared to what happened in this case. And I think it has flagged a whole range of issues in terms of what are the potential lessons that could be learned. I think to a degree, my feeling on it is it's almost a bizarre one in a sense that the system, in many respects, was working as it should have worked, and a lot of the arrangements were in place. And one of the questions I think that comes out of this is what are legitimate indicators of trouble in these types of cases, and what are essentially kind of background factors which can get lost in the noise. And I think one of the challenges we have is to kind of pick up on what are genuine markers of trouble, because as we'll get into in the podcast, one of the areas which attracted a lot of media attention in relation to this case were the ERG assessments, the extremism risk guidance assessments that have been carried out in Khan's case, and in particular in relation to his last ERG assessment in prison versus the ERG assessment that was carried out while he was on probation. And the prison one had assessed him as being of medium risk with a potential to go higher than that after his release. And then the probation assessment after he had been released and had been out for a period of time had assessed him as being at low risk. And obviously this came in for some very, very heavy criticism and scrutiny from, at the inquiry for quite understandable reasons.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, it's interesting. We're talking about risk and the sort of the low-level risk there. Yet, as you say, there were other assessments that regarded him as a high-level risk. It's ironic, perhaps, then, that in terms of the event itself, that he was seen as something of a success story at this Learning Together scheme. Are you surprised at that? Was there sort of a big communication issue? Was this key here in terms of sharing information?
I mean, this is, I think, one of the, if you want, one of the issues coming out of the case is obviously with the benefit of hindsight and knowing exactly what happened. Then when people are looking back at evidence in terms of what was available in the previous 5, 6, 7 years about how Usman kind of behaved in prison, what he got up to there, what he said to other people, and then also how he had behaved after release, anything that is potentially negative or sinister is understandably jumped upon and basically said, well, there was this piece of evidence 4 years ago, how come you didn't realize its significance? And what you tend to find in these cases is there's often a multitude of different bits of evidence. And so one of the challenges in the cases is to assess all of that evidence and then come to a balanced assessment on where you think an individual happens to be. And so, for example, in this particular case, something that was flagged repeatedly was intelligence item from prison where it was suggested that there was intelligence that Khan was planning or would be willing or interested in carrying out attack once he was released. And understandably, this received an awful lot of attention in terms of the discussions at the inquest. How come this wasn't, given more weight? Why wasn't it more taken more seriously? And a whole range of questions connected to that. But I think one of the things when you looked at both the prison staff and what they were saying in relation to this, but also, for example, the representative from MI5, when they were talking about this, is that particular intelligence was only one item among many, and it was of questionable reliability. And in these types of cases, you're going to have many intelligence items, and as a result, you have to exercise care in terms of how much weight you give to any particular one. And I think in this case, I think one of the challenges is that one way to portray the case is that Khan in prison was hiding his true intentions and always intended to re-engage in terrorist activity after he was released, and was basically keeping this hidden from the people who were managing him and working with him and supervising him, and then only revealed his, if you want, authentic and true face at the attack at Fishmonger's Hall, and had been hiding up until then. And my feeling on this is that that's, I think there's a good argument to say that wasn't really the case, and that his motivation could have varied during this period, and that he might have been released from prison and might have genuinely wanted to change and was looking to change. And there's other evidence that came out in the inquiry that suggested that during his probation period, he became increasingly isolated. And this was something that was flagged by some of the people that were working with him, that they were worried at how isolated he was becoming. Very little social interaction, very few activities, stuck inside playing PlayStation, for increasing amounts of time, struggling to get a job for, the common enough experience for many released terrorist offenders. But that potentially what may have happened in that context is that the increasing isolation, which we know is a risk factor for radicalization, became something that of growing importance and significance, and maybe helped tilt him in a direction that he wouldn't necessarily have been planning to go in at his initial release. And so one of the things is that the If you want the risk assessments that we're scoring him as medium, and we're noting progress in a variety of corners, might have been correct. And this, I think, is one of the other elements that comes out of the case, is that risk assessment for terrorist offenders is dynamic. It's not fixed at one point in time, and that the level of risk an individual poses can change over time, and is dynamic and needs to be constantly assessed.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, that's interesting. Because, and you mentioned the issue of probation. I mean, there some questions were raised, weren't they, in the inquiry, about the apparent lack of experience of the probation and the police team managing Khan. I mean, how significant do you think that has been as a factor in this case?
Well, it was one of the criticisms that was particularly labelled. Now, I think the probation worker who was most directly involved in Khan's case, it kind of takes a hit on a number of different levels. The ERG report he completed was much shorter compared to the prison-based report, and that was commented on many times. But the prison-based one was quite a lengthy document. It was about 30 pages plus, which is long for an ERG. I'm not sure that came across completely in the inquest, but then the probation one seemed very, very short in comparison. And I think if everything had gone okay in the case, nobody would have been commenting about the experience or not of the probation worker. But because it went pear-shaped, then the question became: would a more experienced team have spotted indications of trouble or not? And we'll never know for certain. I think they were certainly using well-established frameworks for assessing risk, and both in terms of the MAPA arrangements, but also in terms of the ERG and other things like that. But it failed to detect, certainly in the run-up to the attack, that the risk level had changed, and that Khan was now on a very different path, potentially compared to where he had been, 7-8 months previously. And that's a concern. And I think one of the potential lessons to take away from this is what can be done to detect change in cases like this. And I think there's a recognition that this is particularly challenging. And one example from the case is that MI5's investigation into the case, which automatically kicked in because he was due for release. Then he was released, and there's a degree of monitoring and involvement in the case subsequent to this. But they were basically considering that it was heading towards the end of that investigation, and they hadn't seen any signs or evidence that warranted the investigation to be continued and to be maintained. So there were a lot of professionals involved in this case, not just in relation to the less experienced probation side, but also some very experienced individuals in other quarters who weren't unduly worried about risk in this case. And I think that's one of the the key features to take away from this is were there indicators that really spelled trouble, and were these indicators detectable in a context where you don't have the benefit of hindsight? And what do I mean by that? I mean, how often do these indicators appear in other cases? So as I already mentioned, 96% of terrorist offenders in the UK are released and don't reoffend. What is the degree of presence of similar indicators in those cases? How many of them become isolated? How many of them have trouble gaining employment? What are issues around them moving into their own accommodation? And in many respects, for a lot of them, progressing to their own accommodation, the longer they are out without evidence of re-engaging, these are positive markers. These are indications of progress. And that was kind of where the probation ERG was coming from in terms of it had assessed them as being low risk, partly as a result of factors like that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. slightly separate issue, but related to the same event, of course. Now Khan took a bag with him to the event that contained 3 knives, we're told, and that there was seemingly no bag security or any kind of security really at the event. Would there ordinarily, do you think, at an event that did have offenders and past offenders present, would there ordinarily be some form of security there or bag search there? Is that seen as something unusual? Would you have expected that to be there?
Well, it's I can understand why it wasn't there because of the type of event that it was. This was essentially supposed to be a good news event. This was about rehabilitation. This was about successful case studies of individuals who had been in prison, who committed crime, and who had turned their lives around, and were success stories about positive interventions and positive aftermaths. And so in that type of context, I think it's understandable that you're not assuming that the success stories who are arriving at this event are going to be inherently dangerous themselves. Now, what's potentially relevant in this, but which is developed completely separate to it, is the current work around Martin's Law, which is expected to result in new legislation in the UK this year, coming out of the Manchester Arena bombing, which would put a responsibility on organisers of events to think about risk planning and terrorism risk planning and putting appropriate security measures in place. And potentially, had Martin's Law been in place and been operational, then maybe there would have been more planning and more preparation around the risk of terrorism in terms of the event, and there may have been more security in place, and potentially the attack might have been thwarted as a result of that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Andrew. So, kind of a very general question, really. What implications does this particular case have for risk assessment, and indeed for the rehabilitation of terrorist prisoners or offenders in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know it's a challenging area, full stop. I mean, we knew that beforehand, and this emphasizes it again, and it drives home that there are serious concerns involved in these cases. Overall, reoffending here is very low, which is good news. It's a massive positive to take away, but it does happen, and this case illustrates that it can happen. And we've seen some similar cases elsewhere recently in Europe, which where the same thing has happened, and obviously also an attack in London a couple of months afterwards as well, which also emphasized the point. So there are genuine concerns in relation to terrorist offenders coming out of prison. How can we tell if they are dangerous or not, and what are useful metrics to do this? Now, I think what I would like to see, and certainly what I would recommend happen is, and I'm sure this is happening behind the scenes, but it wasn't something that came out in the inquest, is a comparison between the reoffenders and the majority who don't reoffend, and examining the characteristics, the profiles and the trajectories of these two groups to see where there are differences. And at this stage, in a UK context, we've been using the ERG for 10 years. So there are a lot of cases who have been assessed with the ERG. They've been assessed in prison. They have been assessed after their release. There are an awful lot of ERG, if you want, samples to look at. And so it should be possible to analyze the reoffenders and compare them with the rest and see where significant differences have been found, and where, also equally important, there have been no differences whatsoever, where they have potentially scored exactly the same as each other. And I think that type of analysis is incredibly important at this stage, and is something where we could really develop understanding to an even deeper degree.
So I guess then that was a really fruitful avenue of future research, is what you're suggesting there, Andrew, in that area then?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Now, again, I would expect most of this wouldn't necessarily be academic research. It'll be in-house. I'd imagine it would be MOJ and MI5 and others who do have plenty of psychologists to look at this type of stuff will can carry it out. But it seems to me to be the obvious initial step to do, so that you can make a comparison between the reoffenders and those who haven't. And you can basically, this will shed some insight in terms of where there are markers that could have flagged concern, or should have flagged concern, or at least had the potential to flag concern in a reliable way. And it may be that the answer to that is yes, in which case, great, now you know some items to pay particular attention to, or the answer may have been no. And that would then say, okay, do we need to revise the tools or update them or modify them in some way, so that we can try and incorporate some indication of increased risk that potentially isn't currently being assessed.
Excellent, thank you. Now, as you know, the Terrorist Offenders Restriction of Early Release Bill was introduced into Parliament in February 2020 as emergency legislation, and part of this was to restrict the capacity of terrorist offenders to have early release, and I think it restricted it from being 50% of the sentence to 2/3 of the sentence that they would have to serve. How do you assess that? Do you think that's an effective response, or do you think it kind of defers the problem if you're simply delaying the release of terrorist offenders? Well, what do you make of that, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to be more of a policy that defers the problem, because it wasn't tied into, for example, a requirement that we're doing this because we want to run more interventions with these types of offenders, and we want to do more programs with them. We want to kind of, in a sense, have a better chance to reform them and rehabilitate them, and make sure that the risk assessment is even more reliable than it currently is. That wasn't the rationale really for why this was introduced. It was more. It did seem to be more about kicking the can down the road, so that it became a problem further off, and hoping that the more time that an individual spends in prison, then maybe there's some positive benefit as a result of that. But if you want, the theory behind it wasn't particularly well thought out, and it's I think the part of the challenge we have in this regard is, if you want to keep people in prison for a longer period of time, what are you going to do with them while they are in prison, and how are you going to facilitate change? And I think this has been something that the government traditionally has struggled with, and not just the UK government, many other governments as well have also found this a vexing problem. But it's I think the other element we need to bear in mind with this is the reoffending rate overall is still low for this group, surprisingly low. And I think many people are shocked at just how low it is. It's certainly much lower than we see for most other groups of offenders who are in the system. And does the change in policy, how is that going to affect the reoffending rate? Is it going to make it even lower than it already is? Or could it potentially put it in a negative direction? We don't know. But I think this is a policy that was, if you want, politically popular, because it seems to be a kind of a tough reaction, but not necessarily. My feeling on it was that there wasn't necessarily a clearly thought out way in terms of which this will make a positive difference, either by allowing us to have more effective interventions with these offenders, or giving us even better opportunity for more reliable risk assessment. And I think if it had been tied into either of those approaches, more clearly and more explicitly, I'd probably feel a bit more positive and optimistic about it.
Sure, thanks for that. Now, Carl was also said to have had some sort of radicalizing influence within prison as well. And I know the chapter that you kindly contributed to our volume, Jihadist Terror, you said that radicalization was relatively rare in prison settings. Do you think this is something that we should be more concerned about now, or do you think it remains the case that radicalization in prison settings is quite rare?
I think it still is relatively rare. I mean, this is a really controversial issue. And you'll certainly find voices out there who will say, you know, the prisons are rampant with radicalization. It's like wildfire in there, and ordinary decent prisoners are being turned into hardened extremists left, right, and center. But I think the evidence for that is actually fairly, you know, fairly limited, pretty patchy. Which isn't to say that it doesn't happen. There is a bit of it happening, but it's relatively small scale. And I think the evidence is that it still is relatively small scale within the system. Certainly when we look at the experience around individuals who've gone in with terrorism-related convictions. So individuals like Khan, who went in with a terrorism-related conviction and was held with other terrorism-related offenders within the system. Now, I think part of the, you know, the assessments about the potential for radicalization or the kind of roles that the prisoners play, again, this ties into the intelligence that comes out on them, but it also looks at things like who do they associate with on the wings. And one of the things that did come out in the inquest is at one level, Khan was being criticized because he associated with other terrorism related offenders while he was inside in prison. But there was an acknowledgement, if you looked for it, in, first of all, MI5 assessment and others, you know, that's fairly normal. They tend to be held on similar wings. They tend to have similar experiences, and it's fairly normal for them to, in a sense, hang out together within prison without necessarily meaning that they are deepening their radicalization or that they're trying to recruit others into the group. And I think there's, you know, a challenge in terms of how we assess prison dynamics and the type of standards that we apply when we're assessing it versus, you know, when we've got a context where, for example, there's been a horrific aftermath as here, and then everything tends to be assessed and examined in a very critical light, versus the majority of cases where when they're released, they don't reoffend. And so the same, if you want, critical light isn't shown on those cases. And as a result, you know, the relevance of particular patterns of behavior or of particular elements of a case it becomes less obvious. And this, for me, again, is the reason why work which compares the reoffenders with the non-reoffending group, who are the majority, is so important. Because what we really want to understand is what are the significant differences between these two groups, and can we identify them, and can we make useful distinctions between these two groups? Because if we can do that, then we can identify the truly high-risk individuals and put extra measures in place to manage and mitigate the risk in those cases.
Some fascinating insights. Andrew, once again, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us. Thanks again.
Pleasure to join, Anthony. Always happy to discuss these issues.